Story 1. I was already 20 minutes into patching a stretch of the M6 near the Tickled Trout overpass when I saw her. Not slowly, not with a double take. I just looked up, and she was there, standing on the outer railing of the flyover, about 40 meters ahead of me, perfectly still. My first thought wasn't supernatural. My first thought was, she's going to jump. I killed the engine on the patching machine and climbed down. Protocol is clear. You radio control first, then you approach slowly. You don't run, and you don't shout. I did all of that. I keep my radio and said, "Control? This is Gareth on section 14, northbound near junction 31. I've got a female on the railing of the flyover. Possible jumper. Sending my position now." The response came back steady. "Copy that, Gareth. Emergency services dispatched. Keep visual. Do not approach until advised." I told them I understood, and then I stood there watching her. She wasn't moving. That was the part that started to feel wrong even then. Most people in that state, and I'd seen one before, years earlier on the A59, they're agitated. They shift their weight. They hold the rail tight with both hands, and they react to sounds. This woman just stood, both arms down at her sides, head slightly tilted, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. She was wearing a pale coat, maybe beige or gray, and her hair was dark and loose. That's what I could make out from 40 meters at 2:30 in the morning under amber maintenance lights. I waited about 4 minutes. That's a long time when you're watching someone on a railing. Control came back and told me police were 8 minutes out and to maintain visual. I said, "Understood," and looked back at the flyover. She wasn't there. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I've told the story before and people assume I panicked. I didn't panic. What I felt was a very cold, very specific kind of confusion. The kind where your brain keeps insisting there's a rational explanation and won't let you feel afraid until it's exhausted every option. I thought she'd come down on her own. I thought she'd step back onto the walkway and I'd missed it. I walked quickly toward the flyover, staying on the hard shoulder, and I checked the railing on both sides, the walkway, the access stairs. Nothing. No one. Police arrived and I told them exactly what I'd seen. They searched the canal below with torches. They walked the full span of the flyover. One of the officers, a woman maybe 10 years older than me, asked me twice if I was certain about what I'd seen. Not unkindly, just carefully. I told her I was certain. She wrote it down. They found nothing that night. No one in the canal, no footprints on the railing's outer edge, no disturbance on the walkway. The report logged it as an unconfirmed sighting, and that was that. I went back to work the next night, and the night after that, I told my wife about it over breakfast on the second morning, and she listened and said it sounded like a stress response. That night shifts do strange things to your perception. I didn't argue. Part of me wanted to believe her. 3 weeks later, a Thursday morning, my site supervisor rang me before I'd even had coffee. His voice was strange, careful in a way that made my stomach tighten before he'd said anything substantial. He told me the police had been in touch with the company. A woman's body had been recovered from the Lancaster Canal, roughly half a mile from the Preston stretch of the M6. She'd been in the water for some time. They were asking if any of our crew had reported anything unusual in that area in the past month. I rang the officer who'd attended that night. She remembered me immediately. I told her about the canal, asked if there was any connection. There was a pause before she answered, and that pause told me everything before her words did. She said they were looking into it, that they couldn't share details of an active inquiry, but she asked me to come in and give a formal statement. I went in the following afternoon. A detective sat across from me, younger than I expected, and he asked me to describe the woman again in as much detail as I could. Pale coat, dark hair, arms at her sides, head tilted, perfectly still. He was writing and not looking at me, and I kept talking, and at some point, he stopped writing and just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Happa, use the woman recovered from the canal, based on our pathologist's initial assessment. She had been in the water for between 3 and 4 weeks at time of recovery. I didn't understand what he was telling me at first. I did the arithmetic out loud, almost accidentally, 3 to 4 weeks before the Thursday I'd received the phone call. He nodded before I'd finished the sentence. She had been dead before I saw her. I've sat with that for a long time now, years. I've thought about every rational exit from that conclusion. I've considered that the pathologist's estimate had a margin of error. I've considered that there may have been another woman, coincidentally on that flyover, coincidentally dressed similarly, who simply walked away before I reached her. I've considered that I was tired and the amber lights and the stress of the shift created something in my visual cortex that wasn't real. I've considered all of it seriously and at length. The detective told me eventually, months later, when they closed the case, that the woman's name was Linda. She was 43. She'd gone missing from her home in Bamber Bridge on a Tuesday evening in late October. There was no evidence of foul play. The inquest recorded an open verdict. She had no history of mental illness on record, though her family said she'd been struggling privately. She'd been found in the water roughly a mile and a half from the flyover where I'd seen the figure. They never established how she got into the canal. No witnesses, no CCTV, no nothing. She was simply found. What I keep returning to, and this is the part I find hardest to explain without sounding like I've lost my mind, is the way she was standing, arms down, still, not distressed. If you were going to invent a ghost story, you'd have her reaching towards you, or screaming, or doing something dramatic. This woman was just standing there, like she was waiting for something, like she needed someone to look at her. Like 40 meters and a set of amber maintenance lights were the only witnesses she was going to get. I don't work nights anymore. That's not entirely because of Linda. There were other reasons, age being one of them, my knees being another. But I won't pretend she had nothing to do with it. My wife stopped asking me about it after the first year because she could tell the question took something out of me each time. She understood without needing it explained. What I know is this. At 2:37 in the morning on a Tuesday in November 1987, I looked up from a pothole on the M6 near Preston, and I saw a woman standing on a flyover railing who, according to the best medical evidence available, had already been dead for up to 4 weeks. I reported it. I followed procedure. I told the truth to every person who asked me, and she was still there when I looked up, and she was gone before I could reach her, and her name was Linda. And I've never stopped being grateful that at least one person saw her before she was found. Even if that person was just a maintenance worker with a radio and a patching machine and no framework at all for what he was looking at, I think she just didn't want to be alone out there. That's the part I choose to believe. It's the only part that gives me any peace. Story 2. My name is Elise Marchand, and my job that night was to replace 3 faulty luminaire control units in the Tunis de la Chaussée on the N5 outside Charleroi. It's simple enough work on paper: climb the access ladder, swap the units, test the relay, log the job, and go home. I had done it dozens of times. I was good at it. I liked the quiet of night shifts, the emptiness of the tunnels, the way the world felt like it belonged only to me between midnight and 5 in the morning. That night, I wish it had stayed that way. I was on my second unit, about 6 meters up the access ladder, when my radio crackled. I didn't think anything of it at first. The tunnel walls are reinforced concrete and old iron bracketry, and the signal inside was always unreliable. My supervisor, Joris, had already checked in at midnight and told me he'd be at the depot if I needed anything. After that, the radio was usually quiet, until I called in my completion report. So when the crackle came, I assumed it was Joris with a follow-up, maybe asking about their relay fault on Unit 1 that I'd logged 20 minutes earlier. But it wasn't Joris. The voice that came through was male, low, and completely calm. Not a worker's voice. Not the clipped, tired efficiency of someone on a night shift. This was measured, deliberate, like someone reading from a list they had memorized a long time ago. He was whispering in French, but the words were not instructions or conversation. They were numbers, coordinates. I recognized the format because we used GPS references in our maintenance logs degrees, minutes, and decimal points. He read them twice, slowly, then paused. Then he said something that made my hand tighten on the ladder rung so hard my knuckles ached. He said in a flat, quiet voice, 3 jours, 3 days. Then the radio went silent. I stayed on that ladder for probably 30 seconds without moving. My brain was doing what brains do, looking for the rational explanation first. Wrong frequency. Someone's GPS unit is accidentally broadcasting. A trucker with a modified radio. The tunnel distorted a fragment of someone else's conversation into something that sounded organized when it wasn't. I climbed down, sat on my equipment case, and replayed it in my head. The coordinates had been clear. The pause between them and the words 3 days had been intentional. There was no other conversation around it, no background noise, no engine sound. Just the voice, the numbers, and the silence after. I called Joris. He answered on the third ring, groggy and irritated. I told him exactly what I'd heard. I even read back the coordinates I'd scribbled onto my work order sheet. I don't know why I wrote them down. Instinct maybe, or the habit of logging everything. He told me it was interference. He said the N5 corridor sometimes picked up fragments from emergency service frequencies or cross-border transmissions from the Ardennes region. He told me to finish the job and not worry about it. I could hear in his voice that he thought I was spooked by nothing, that he was already half asleep again before I hung up. I finished the job. I replaced the third unit, tested the relay, packed my equipment, and drove home. But I kept the work order sheet with the coordinates on it. I don't know why. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket instead of filing it with the rest of my paperwork. Something about throwing it away felt wrong. 3 days later, I was back at the depot doing a van inspection when Joris came in from the car park with his phone in his hand and a look on his face I had never seen before. He pulled up a news article and held the screen toward me without saying anything. A woman's body had been found that morning by a farmer checking his fence line on a rural tract near Gerpenis, about 11 kilometers south of where I had been working. She had been there for several days, the article said. Police were treating it as suspicious. I already knew what I was going to find before I unfolded that work order sheet, but I unfolded it anyway, standing in the depot car park in the gray morning light, and I read the coordinates I had written 3 nights ago, and I compared them to the location named in the article, and my hands started shaking in a way I could not control. I called the police myself, not Joris, not the depot manager, not anyone at the company. I called the Charleroi police directly, and I told them I needed to speak to whoever was handling the Gerpenis case. I expected to be dismissed. I expected to be told to email something, to fill out a form, or to wait. Instead, within 2 hours, 2 detectives were sitting across from me in a room at the commissariat on Rue de Marcinelle, and I was handing them my work order sheet with the coordinates written in my own handwriting, time-stamped by the job log on our system at 0047 on a Tuesday morning. What they told me, carefully and without giving me more than they had to, was that the coordinates matched the location within a margin of less than 40 meters. They asked me to walk through everything. The frequency, the voice, the words, the timing. They recorded all of it. One of the detectives, a woman named Inspector Daoust, asked me twice whether I was certain about the phrase trois jours. I told her I was certain. She wrote something down and didn't share it with me. The investigation took 8 months. I was contacted 4 more times during that period, each time asked to confirm small details, each time told as little as possible in return. What eventually came out, partly through the trial, partly through a journalist who covered it in detail for a regional paper, was that the woman found near Gerpenis was 31 years old. She had been reported missing 2 days before I heard that broadcast. The man eventually charged with her murder had used a handheld radio transmitter modified to broadcast on emergency service adjacent frequencies. Investigators believed he had transmitted the coordinates as a form of communication with someone else, someone who was supposed to retrieve something from that location, or perhaps confirm the disposal. That second person was never identified, which means someone was supposed to receive that broadcast. Someone who was not me, and by pure accident, by the tunnel's concrete walls bending and reflecting a signal that was never meant to travel in that direction, it found my radio instead. I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that if the tunnel had been constructed differently, if I had been on the other side of the wall, if the frequency had scattered left instead of right, that broadcast would have reached whoever it was intended for, and I would have driven home that night and filed my paperwork and never known any of it existed. I also think about the man's voice, how calm it was, how rehearsed. He had done enough of this that reading coordinates over a radio in the dark felt routine to him. That is the part that stays with me more than anything else. Not what I heard, but how he sounded when he said it. Like he was nothing. Like he was just another task on a list. I still work night shifts. I still go into tunnels alone, but I log every radio transmission now, no matter how small, no matter how much it sounds like interference. I bought a small digital recorder that I keep clipped beside my radio on shift, and it runs from the moment I enter a work zone to the moment I leave. Yoris thinks I am being paranoid. Maybe I am, but that woman's name was Adeline Renard, and somebody put her in the ground and then calmly read out her location over a radio like it was a weather report. And the only reason anyone ever found her was because a tunnel bent a signal in the wrong direction and I happened to be listening. I write it down every single time, because the next time it might matter even more. Story 3. I was 3 hours into my shift when it happened. Not 3 hours of easy work either. 3 hours of patching gravel washouts on the Silver City Highway 60-something kilometers north of Broken Hill, with nothing but red dirt and dead scrub on both sides, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I'm a maintenance worker for the NSW Roads Department. I have been for 11 years. I've done plenty of night shifts on remote stretches. You get used to the dark out there, or you tell yourself you do. That night in July 2021, I learned I'd been lying to myself the whole time. My headlights were the only thing cutting through the black when I saw him, standing right on the shoulder of the road, maybe 40 meters ahead. Small, way too small. I actually said out loud to nobody, "What the hell?" and slowed the ute down because my brain refused to process it correctly. A kid, a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing completely still in the middle of nowhere at 20 past 1 in the morning. No car, no tent, no adult, nothing. I stopped about 10 meters from him and kept my headlights on. He didn't flinch, didn't shield his eyes, just stood there looking straight at me like he'd been expecting me specifically. I grabbed my torch and got out, and I'll tell you, my heart was already doing something strange, not quite fear yet, more like the feeling you get when something is so wrong, your body hasn't figured out the right response. "Hey mate," I called out. "You all right? Where's your mom and dad?" He didn't answer. He just turned his head slightly to the left, toward the gravel shoulder running alongside the road. Then, he looked back at me. I walked closer. He was wearing a plain gray shirt and dark shorts. No shoes. His feet were clean, which I remember thinking was strange given the red dirt everywhere. His face was calm, not distressed, not confused. Calm in a way that kids aren't when they're lost or scared, which made it worse somehow. "Hey, talk to me, mate. Are you hurt? Where did you come from?" He opened his mouth and said very clearly, very quietly, "She's under the road." I stopped walking. "What?" He said it again. Same flat tone, same calm face. "She's under the road." I looked at the shoulder he'd glanced at. It was a long gravel section we'd relayed 2 nights before a standard shoulder repack after erosion damage. Fresh compacted gravel, maybe 15 meters long. I looked back at the boy. Who's under the road? He didn't answer. He just kept looking at me, and I got the sudden, overwhelming sense that he had done his part, like he delivered a message, and was now simply waiting for me to act on it. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor. No signal. Common as breathing out there. I had my UHF radio in the ute, and I went back to it, called through to the depot, and told them I had an unaccompanied child on the Silver City Highway at marker post 61. While I was on the radio, I kept one eye on the boy. He hadn't moved. I got back out and crouched down to his level. "Listen, mate. Help is coming, okay? Can you tell me your name?" "Nothing." "Are you from Broken Hill? Did someone drop you off here?" "Nothing." "Is someone hurt? Did you see something happen?" He looked at the shoulder again. Just that same slow turn of the head. I stood up and walked to the edge of the repack, shining my torch across it. It looked exactly as it had when we'd finished it. Flat, compacted, edges tamped down. But when I crouched and looked closer, I could see it. Along the inner edge, where the gravel met the old road base, the surface had a slight depression, barely visible, but it wasn't there 2 nights ago. I knew because I'd run the compactor over that exact section myself. Something had settled. I stood up, and I felt physically cold despite it being maybe 8 degrees cold in a different way, deeper than temperature. I went back to the ute, got on the radio again. And this time, I told him to call the police. I said I thought there might be something buried in the shoulder repack on the Silver City at marker 61. The woman on the other end asked me to repeat that. I repeated it. Then I turned around. The boy was gone. I swept the torch in every direction. Red, dirt, scrub, road. Thoroughly, pointing mule in each direction, calling out. I went off the road edge into the scrub, pushing through low mulga, calling out. I checked under the ute. I am not embarrassed to tell you that I was shaking by then, not from cold, but from something I still can't name properly. He had been 10 meters from me. There was nowhere to go. No vehicle had passed. He was just gone. 2 police vehicles arrived from Broken Hill 40 minutes later. I told them everything. I told them everything. I told them about the boy and what he'd said. I watched one of the officers make the face that people make when they're deciding whether you're a reliable witness or a lunatic. The other one, a woman, senior constable, didn't make that face. She just looked at the shoulder and said, "Show me where." I showed her the depression. She called it in, and they taped off the area. At around 4 a.m., a forensics team arrived. I sat in my ute and watched them work with lights and handheld ground equipment. At 5:17 a.m., with the sky just beginning to gray at the edges, one of the officers came to my window and told me they'd found remains. A woman, buried less than a meter down in the gravel repack, positioned in a way that suggested she'd been placed there after we'd initially laid the base layer and before the final compaction, sometime in that 12-hour window between our 2 sessions. She'd been murdered. That's all I was told at the time. The investigation ran for months. Her name was released 6 weeks later. She was 34, from Silverton, reported missing by her partner 4 days after that night. The partner was arrested. He'd followed the road crew schedule publicly available through a maintenance advisory notice and used the window between our shifts to bury her in the fresh base layer, knowing we'd compact it closed the next day. He'd nearly gotten away with it. They never identified the boy. I filed a full statement about him. The investigating detectives searched every missing child record, every nearby property, and every surrounding community. No child matching his description was reported missing before, during, or after that night. No one from any station or homestead in the region reported a child unaccounted for. No footprints were found in the surrounding dirt beyond where I'd seen him standing. A forensic tracker was brought in specifically for that. Nothing. The senior constable, the one who hadn't given me that face, called me personally about 3 months later. She said they'd closed the search for the boy and that the official record would note an unidentified witness. She paused after she said it, and I could hear her choosing her next words carefully. Then she said, "Whatever it was that sent you to that spot that night, I'm glad it did." I've thought about that conversation a lot since. I've thought about his clean feet on the red dirt, about the way he looked at me like he knew exactly who was coming, about the fact that if I hadn't stopped, if I'd ridden off that shape in the dark as a trick of headlights and kept driving, that woman's husband would have walked free, and she would still be in the ground. I don't know what I saw that night. I'm not a person who believes in things I can't explain, or I wasn't. I still go out on night shifts. I still drive the Silver City Highway, but I scan the shoulders differently, now slowly, carefully, like I'm looking for something I can't quite name. And every time I pass marker post 61, I slow down. Not because I expect to see anything, just out of respect for whatever it was that stood in my headlights that night and decided I was worth flagging down.